From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the war in Ukraine 8 months on. We'll be discussing Russia's growing attacks on critical infrastructure, its recent deployment of Iranian drones and their impact on the battlefield, the potential nuclear threat, and where things might be headed from here. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. There's a lot to discuss today, but thankfully we've got two great guests joining the program who can help us make sense of things. General Philip Breedlove and Iulia-Sabina Joja. General Breedlove is a retired United States Air Force general who served in a variety of key roles during his 39-year career, including as Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander of U.S. European Command. He's the Distinguished Chair of MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative and a Distinguished Professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Iulia is a Senior Fellow and Director of MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative and Director of its Afghanistan Watch project. She teaches courses on European security at Georgetown and George Washington universities. General Breedlove, Iulia, welcome to the podcast, and thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me.
General Breedlove, we've just passed the 8-month mark since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Taking a sort of macro-level view of the conflict, where do things stand?
Well, these are just my judgments, but I follow closely. And what I would describe right now is Russia is in an operational retreat. We divide sort of the effects of war into strategic, operational, and tactical. Russia had a strategic defeat and retreat from the north, then a strategic defeat and retreat from Kharkiv. And now we are in a fight in the south where they are not yet at the strategic level, but in what I would call an operational level retreat. They know now that they're losing this battle on the ground. And so what we see from them, and I'm sure we may talk about them more later, a lot of sort of diversionary attempts to change the course of this war separate from the fight on the ground. And that is to break up the alliance and the support for the Ukrainian cause. And just to throw some teasers out, I think these include increased nuclear threats, the threats of dirty bombs, cable cuts, pipeline cuts, anything to get the focus of the West on fear and get their focus off of the fact that Russia is losing on the battlefield.
Iulia, Russia has also been ramping up its attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, including power plants and water supply facilities. How widespread is the damage from that, and what impact is that having on day-to-day life for Ukrainians?
Yeah, that's the one thing that I am most worried about. And I guess I have been worried about for months to come, because while militarily, as General Breedlove was eloquently pointing out, Russia is losing. They have a lot of instruments to still fight Ukraine in a dirty way, in a very affordable way, but with maximum impact. And these attacks on the critical energy infrastructure, particularly, are really having a significant impact on the ground. According to Ukrainian reports, about 40% of the critical energy infrastructure has been destroyed. This affects not just Ukraine, but for instance, also Moldova next door. But for Ukraine, this means that millions of people are being deprived of energy for longer periods of time as we're going into the fall and lower temperatures. And on an everyday basis, we see these reports now coming out of major cities like the capital, Kyiv. There's now energy blackouts every single day. And as the temperatures drop, this will be harder and harder. The problem with that, of course, is that energy infrastructure is harder to build. It takes a while. And so while we're seeing European and American partners and allies of Ukraine ramping up their support, we're basically just fixing problems that we could have prevented earlier on by giving them military aid, such as comprehensive air defense systems, to be able to prevent these attacks. And of course, like General Breedlove was saying, last note on this is intended to break the resolve of Ukrainians, though here, as we would have expected here in the West, this is not happening. Even though Ukrainians will suffer through the winter dearly, and this could have ample consequences, this does not affect morale neither in Ukraine nor in the neighboring countries, because people are already used to Russia fighting dirty and targeting civilians in any possible way. And so we just need to fix it now, and it's a bit more expensive. And of course, the damage is, affecting Ukrainians on an everyday level.
General Breedlove, as Yulia just mentioned, we're in late October now and winter is nearly upon us. How does weather impact the conflict, and how much scope is there for movement on the ground in the coming months?
Well, I love the common play on words now from the famous movies Game of Thrones. Winter is coming, and it's coming in a couple of different ways. The first one, of course, is the physical way that you mentioned. There will be literally three changes this winter that we expect. First, the sort of rainy, muddy, sloppy beginning of winter, where movement is going to be hampered, especially for large and heavy forces. Then there will be the hard freeze. And this will actually be a time where heavy armored forces can move even more freely, including places that they can't move in the spring and the summer because of the hard freezes. And then coming into the spring again, the whole process will reverse. Things will thaw, once again get wet and muddy and hamper military movement. So we have, as I said, sort of a three-step process that the armies are going to have to plan for and set their timelines. The real impact of the winter for me has already been laid out by Yulia, and let me just add a few thoughts to that. And that is, again, I fully believe that Mr. Putin understands he's losing this war at this moment. And those around him are beginning to understand that Russia is losing this war. And so they are now pulling out all of those tools that we talked about above, the nuclear threats of dirty bombs, cutting cables, cutting pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. But more importantly now, Mr. Putin begins his war on the European people. It's bigger than just Ukraine. Mr. Putin intends to make this winter in Europe cold, miserable, and even when he can, hungry for the people of Europe. His entire intention is to separate the people of Europe, the electorate, from the leaders they have elected, because the leaders are now supporting Ukraine and supporting Ukraine's war effort. And Mr. Putin sees that. And if he can make the people angry at their elected officials because they're asking those questions like, why am I cold? Why am I hungry when you're spending money on Ukraine? And Mr. Putin, knowing that he's losing militarily, will try to win politically in this winter. And honestly, that worries me a lot worse than what's going on the ground in Ukraine to a certain degree.
One other thing that you haven't touched on so far, General Breedlove, but that I wanted to get your thoughts on is the considerable reporting we've seen in recent weeks about the Russian military's use of Iranian drones to attack targets in Ukraine. What sort of drones is it using, and how has that affected the war?
Well, there's several drones that Iran is now supplying and in some degree flying for Russia. The two biggest ones are the Mojave 6 and the Shahed 129. These are the ones that we hear the most about. There's another one, and I'll murder the pronunciation. There's another smaller drone now called the Kyb, KYB or KYBS, that is a smaller, much more tactical drone that we're starting to see a lot of on the battlefield. All of these are Iranian. They are to some degree flown by or overseen by Iranians. We know that there is an enclave of Iranians in Crimea that are flying from the south, and now we're beginning to see reporting of Iranians in Belarus to fly from the north. And so this is a growing concern. Now, the Ukrainian military has actually shot down quite a few of these drones. But the fact of the matter is, there are so many being launched that many are still getting through, and they are having some effect. Now, I don't see any real military effect, but once again, I think Russia understands it's losing militarily. This is about terrorizing the people. This is about ruining the electrical grid and the transmission of fuels, again, to make this a cold, miserable winter for the people. And that's what I think is the biggest effect of these drones.
Yulia, the EU was quick to introduce new sanctions against individuals and companies involved in Iran's drone program for deploying them to Ukraine. The impact of that is likely to be largely symbolic, but I wanted to ask how Iran's growing involvement in the Ukraine conflict is being viewed in Europe more broadly.
Indeed, yeah. The sanctions are a bit of a standard thing that the EU also did back in 2014 with Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, where they just slapped a bunch of sanctions on symbolically, as you said, and then they were maintained, but they didn't really have an impact, and they weren't even targeted to have an impact. Now, there's a few aspects to Iran in the Ukraine war. The first one for Europe, the first one is that the broad international aspect of this. We've seen reports and speculations of Russia asking for, as they're running out of weapons to terrorize the Ukrainian population, civilian and of course the military, that they've been starting to beg for weapons from their partners and allies. And so far, it looks like China has said no, North Korea has said no, and so we're left with Iran that has combat experience, that is waging a very aggressive way of warfare in many places in the broader Middle East. But this also brings me to how Europeans see this. And I would venture here to say that they're pretty shocked because this is the first time we see actually Iran in Eastern Europe. We've seen Iran with terrorist attacks in Western Europe during the Cold War, but it's been a while and they've certainly never been present in Eastern Europe. And so that makes the conflict internationally, for many that so far have watched it in the Middle East and beyond, as not just a regional thing anymore, as the Russians were trying to portray for a long time, that this is just a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the West has stepped in indirectly with aid. Now it's becoming truly international, with Iran being present on the ground in occupied Ukraine and Russia and being directly involved in this fight. It's the first time we see such direct involvement of a third power. Even Belarus, Russia's ally in the region, has supported the war indirectly from their territory, but has not been involved as directly as Iran now is. And so that points then to my last point, and that's one of going back to sanctions and a bit seeing the conflict in not just military terms, but political terms. And I would connect it to the fact that Iranians, the Iranian diaspora in Europe, has been pointing to the fact that Europe is lukewarm when it comes to a response to Iran, not just for what Iran is doing in Ukraine, but also for what is happening right now inside Iran. And so here, the parallel I think interesting is at the beginning of the Russian 2022 full scale invasion in Ukraine, I'm convinced that what has been driving European leaders to step up their support quicker than we would have expected was the fact that we saw these mass protests across Europe for the first time, not for peace, but in support of Ukraine and in support of stopping this war on Western and internationally correct terms. And so now, over the last few days, we've seen these protests now from the Iranian diaspora particularly in Berlin, being really massive. And so that tells me that pressure is increasing on European leaders to rethink their Iran policy, not just in terms of what Iran is doing in Ukraine, but the overall bilateral relationship between the EU and its member states on one side and Iran on the other side, in terms of pushing back more against Iran and coming under pressure to impose not just symbolic sanctions.
General Breedlove, there's also been reporting suggesting that Iran may be supplying ballistic and/or cruise missiles to Russia as well. Why would Moscow be turning to Tehran for missiles, and what does that tell us about the state of its military?
Well, the bottom line is Russian kit is, especially the sophisticated kit, the precise long range kit, is running thin. Their magazine is running thin because they've expended so much of it. An example in case, they are now using surface to air missiles in a surface to surface mode because they've run out of the precise capabilities in their magazines. And on top of that, literally, their kit is not performing well. So they are looking for capability out there. They are looking for things that do work well and they can get more of fast. And that's why they reach to Iran. And I just want to agree with everything Yulia said. And in my parlance, in a very simple military way of saying it, Iran is in this war. They are in this war in the south from Crimea, and we believe now they're setting to be in the war from the north, from Belarus. And so we in the West, as Yulia very nicely laid out, need to figure out how we're going to address that.
Yulia, I want to turn now to the issue of the nuclear risk. In recent days, Russia's repeatedly asserted that Ukraine is planning to set off a dirty bomb. What's your read on that? Is it just disinformation, or could it be part of an effort to lay the groundwork for some sort of an escalatory response?
Yeah, it's funny that you already in your question point to something that now has become, just over the last few months, kind of common sense, but we used to be a big question for us in the West just last year, and that is Russia ever telling the truth? And if it does, is that just a mirroring of I intend to do this thing, and so I'm going to blame it on others? It seems to already become, a common understanding, which in my understanding is really important. Now, I think it can be either or. We certainly have seen Russia in the larger picture, particularly ever since 2014, preemptively threatening with a nuclear attack in a very vague way, but against the West. When they annexed Crimea the first time, before they even finalized the process, they went out and said to the West, "Don't you even dare think about supporting Ukraine because we have the nuclear weapon." And so over the last few months, we've all witnessed how Russia has been amping up its nuclear threat rhetoric. And the Western response has been pretty clear in that this is obviously not okay. It would create a precedent that would completely change the conflict in its nature. And with these specific accusations of a dirty bomb, first we talked about a tactical nuke from Russia. Now we're talking about a dirty bomb. All of these things have been sort of building up from Russia with a very clear response. We saw this week the French, the British, and the United States leaders putting together a communique basically saying Russia is lying. This is nonsense about a Ukrainian dirty bomb. And also this week, the NATO Secretary General has pointed to the same issues, but it doesn't clear up the fact whether it's one thing, whether it's just disinformation and basically psychological warfare against all of us in the West, or whether it is something that Russia is planning. My fear is that we're going to see more of these stories, more of these threats, just like they have been ramping up from the Kremlin over the last few months. They will continue to do so in the coming months through the winter and perhaps even into the spring. Because what basically Russia is doing is trying to test us to see how the West is reacting, how deep its support is, and how much they can push over red lines like they have been doing in the non-conventional but non-nuclear sphere, if we're thinking about what has been happening in Ukraine and in Europe over the last few months. And so whether they are going to do it or not, nobody knows, maybe not even them. But there's two things that to me are the most important that we should understand. One is that Russia is trying really hard and oftentimes unfortunately succeeding in waging mass psychological warfare against basically hundreds of millions of people in the region and beyond, because we talk about this even on this side of the Atlantic in the United States. And the other thing is that the only thing we can do, the West, to prevent this from happening is to build deterrence and make it rhetorically also very, very clear that if Russia would take into account seriously changing the conflict and dropping some kind of a dirty bomb or a tactical bomb on the battlefield in Ukraine, the costs would be significantly higher than the benefits. So that's the only thing we can do, make clear to them that they shouldn't be doing this because the price will be very high without, and this is, lesson number one in strategy, in these kinds of conflicts in general. Breedlove can tell you a lot more than I can on these things, but without, very importantly, without going into specifics, but making clear on a very abstract level, but publicly, that this is absolutely unacceptable and that costs will be high without the other side knowing what kind of costs these will be.
General Breedlove, I'd like to get your thoughts here as well, since this is such a key issue. How likely do you think it is that Russia might use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine? And were it to happen, how should the U.S. respond?
Well, first of all, once again, I want to agree with everything that Dr. Joja has said. I have a slightly different set of thoughts on it, but I agree with everything she said. First of all, I think it still is unlikely that they will do it, but it is possible. And we have to think about it and be concerned about it. Russia is increasingly desperate, and they want us to be afraid. This is their most effective weapon. They are trying to instill fear in Western leaders and Western people so that they will change their support for this war. Again, it is their most effective weapon. Frankly, we are already deterred, and they seek to further deter us. Secondly, I would just say that Russia, I believe, knows that they will lose more than they gain if they use a nuclear weapon. They're likely to lose some of their quote unquote best supporters now. China, India, others will probably step away from them if they start using nuclear weapons. And I think they understand that. And frankly, their soldiers are not prepared to fight on a nuclear battlefield. And so they would create not only a problem for Ukraine, but they would create a problem for their own soldiers. So they will lose more than they gain. And then third, I think it's important, and Dr. Joja mentioned this to a certain degree. Russia knows the cost militarily to them will be high. I do not think the West will reply with a nuclear weapon. In fact, I'm virtually positive. Unless Russia's attack is so egregious, if it is counter value, meaning the attack is against a civilian target, that would be the only time I think the West would consider such a thing. But the West is extremely unlikely to respond with a nuclear weapon. But the important thing, and Russia knows it, the West, unlike Russia, that is unable now to mount a precise strike of intense conventional impact, the West is absolutely able to do that. The West can and has demonstrated, and I think will, strike in a conventional manner that will have a very large impact to Russia's ability to wage war. And I think Russia has to respect that. We don't have to, in the West, use nukes. We can do debilitating damage to Russia conventionally. And so I think that's what we would see.
Yulia, after not speaking for months, the U.S. Secretary of Defense and Russian Defense Minister have exchanged several calls in the past few days. Not much has come out about the details, but in light of our kind of recent topic of discussion, I'm curious to get your thoughts. What does that sudden uptick in communication suggest to you?
It's really speculative of me to try to read anything into the Russian side. If I take a step back, of course, it's really important that we have, even on a public level, without details, the knowledge that there is communication. Because whether it's a Cold War or a hot war, this is a major risk for a big chunk of the world, and we want to have communication between the United States and the Russian Federation, constant, predictable, so that we can avoid, just like in the Cold War, an accident. We want to make clear from the United States and the Western side what our position is, and we want to have direct communication. And though I don't want to put words into the leadership in Ukraine, President Zelensky has been saying that throughout the war in different instances, that someone needs to be talking to the regime in Moscow to exactly prevent wars from happening. So to me, it's a good thing, and I feel a lot more, let's say, calm about a direct line of communication between the United States and Russia, as opposed to previous months when a lot of the conversation was sort of taken over in terms of communication by capitals in Europe that are frankly just not leading support for Ukraine. It's the United States that puts up double of what European institutions and member states put together. And so it's only right for that to happen. And the United States has had a very clear position throughout this war and is the most capable of representing the West, just in mere numbers. Now, when it comes to the Russian side, I don't know. I feel this is again speculation, but I'm guessing at some point that the Minister of Defense of Russia, Mr. Shoigu, was trying to convey the message of the dirty bomb. So he is, representing the Kremlin policy, and I cannot speculate whether this conversation or this dialogue in one form or another will endure. But for now, it's good that we've had some kind of direct communication between the United States DoD and the Russian counterpart.
Before we wrap up, I want to get both of your thoughts on where you see things going forward and what you'll be watching most carefully in the coming weeks and months, starting with you, General Breedlove.
Well, thanks for the opportunity today. And I would just like to sort of set expectations. And first and foremost, our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people. Our prayers are certainly for their fielded forces, as they're going to have a tough winter. And we want to do everything we can to make them successful. But having said that, I believe that the toughest battles of this winter will be for the hearts and minds of Western leaders, Western people, and certainly in America in the political diatribe to maintain support for Ukraine. Russia will pull out every tool it can to further scare the leaders of the West and to further discourage the people of the West to try to rip them from supporting Ukraine. And this is what we need to keep our eyes on as we go through this winter.
Iulia, you've got the last word. Any final thoughts?
I can only try to slightly add to what General Breedlove was saying because I agree with him entirely. Ukraine is bearing the heavy brunt throughout this winter and into the spring, but the battle is increasingly for the, as he was putting it, the hearts and minds of the transatlantic space, both in the United States and here, and so. Me too. I'm watching carefully. I'm guessing just like Russia does midterms here, because as I was saying a bit earlier, United States support for this is absolutely vital and crucial. And I'm also watching, even on in a longer term, what is happening in Europe with concern, because for now, storage facilities of energy are almost full in Europe. So this winter will be more or less, at least for EU territory, fine. But they're full with gas from Russia, and I think that one of the most important aspects of winning this war for the West is the hard and long-term decoupling of Europe from Russia. It's hard to do, but just like this winter is going to be difficult in the long term, in the broader context of this conflict, so will the next summer when Europeans will have to ask themselves the question of how to get through the next winter.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but General Breedlove, Iulia, thank you both very much for joining the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You can follow all of MEI's coverage of the war in Ukraine and Iran's growing role on our website at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to both of our guests, as well as to our listeners for tuning in, and to our podcast editor, Hans Fay, for all of his work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.